So, in this class, we're talking about conflict management. We often see this type of area of study called conflict resolution. And just to think about the difference between if we titled this class conflict resolution or conflict management, and what is the kind of contextual nuances of the differences of resolution versus management. We definitely want to resolve our conflicts. That's a really big goal. However, that's not always possible. In the field of communication, we have these myths of communication. And one of those myths is not all communication can solve all problems, meaning that sometimes you can have the best communicators, you can have the best mediators, and we still can walk away from a conversation or a stakeholder meeting or a negotiation with the exact same problem. And maybe some of you could come up with some examples of times where you were really trying to put your best effort forward in a dialogue, talking to someone, and they were putting their best foot forward, and both people walked away with the exact same problem. So that is why we kind of lean towards the idea of conflict, managing the conflict, because we can't always resolve our conflicts. And that takes a little bit of the pressure off always coming to a resolution. That's also really difficult because we really like to check things off our list. We like to say it's done and done, right? And sometimes that's not always possible. Sometimes it is. So we want to keep that in mind as we're moving forward in this class. This video is your week 1 lecture for Com 340 conflict management, and I'm your instructor. Hello, I'm Sarah Sheldrick. I have a PowerPoint for week 1, so I'll share that here in a minute. I don't always have a PowerPoint. I don't always use them. So this is one of those things where I just feel like to start us off, it's nice to have a visual to go with me just chatting away here. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'm hoping this shares okay. It looks like it did the right screen. Let me put that into slideshow mode. So I'm much on, there's our first slide. All right, let's see where we got now. All right, it looks like we're all good. So the nature of conflict, what is conflict? We're going to look at some of the traditional definitions of conflict and managing conflict. So when we think about the word conflict, it comes from the Latin word to configure, or to strike together. And when we think, I have this picture from Naked and Afraid, one of my favorite reality TV shows. I really like this image. They're trying to start a fire, which always seems to be the top priority, right? And fire is one of those great metaphors for conflict management that we are working towards. So to strike together, or the Latin word to configure, as it says here, fire needs all these components. It needs oxygen, it needs fuel, it needs that spark, and all of those things mixed together to make conflict, to make the fire, which is the metaphor we want to think about for conflict. I also like fire as a metaphor for conflict because fire is an essential ingredient, right? Our Naked and Afraid contestants know that they got to get that fire going or it's going to be a pretty miserable time of it. So the same we want to start thinking about for conflict, that yes, conflict is something that is uncomfortable. Sometimes it's awkward. Sometimes it's very painful. Just like fire, we can get burned by conflict. But however, we kind of need it. We don't just kind of need it. I'm going to propose that your relationships need conflict. They need conflict to be stronger, to make your relationship stronger. You need conflict to grow, for the relationship to grow and move through the challenges of life and the challenges of relationships, the challenges of how we come together. When we think about creativity or we think about innovation, there's an element of conflict that had to occur for us to move through getting to the goal or the innovation or the creative element. So that's one way, and we're going to really play around. That's one way to think about conflict through this idea of fire. And we're going to play around with language this term. I'll ask you at certain points in the term to think about how you're using language to begin conversations. How are we using language to reframe and frame our experiences and perspectives? And so that means there's this element of metaphor in this class, and language in general is metaphorical. But as you are thinking about conflicts you've had in the past, maybe issues you're dealing with right now, what are the words you're using to describe that? Let's start becoming aware of how we use language. We also want to think about the benefit of conflict as an opportunity. Conflict is opportunity to problem solve. When we think about the things that we care about most, whether we are on our jobs, whether we're a student in a class, or whether it's our trying to work on our relationships with either family, parents, children, or our romantic relationships or our friendships, we want to think about a conflict as a moment where we have an opportunity for moving into problem solving. So instead now of thinking of conflict as either being just bad, we are now going to separate and change how we're thinking about conflict as being dysfunctional conflict or functional conflict. And when you can hold these two ideas in your hand, now we have somewhere to go where we can start building the tools that we need. And I'll be using the word tools a lot. Every week, I will be giving you new tools for your toolbox so that you can start finding the things, the elements that you need to manage those conflicts, to jump into opportunities so that you can be more functional in your dialogues and conversations so that you can work through those issues. The first tool we need is a definition for conflict. Okay, so I have a couple of older definitions, 1956 and 1973. So we can see when we get to the Hawker and Wilmot, which I have the book here, that some of the way that I've constructed and designed this class comes from Hawker and Wilmot's core definition for interpersonal conflict. So our first definition here, social conflict is a struggle between opponents. So there's that word struggle. We're going to be using that word a lot. And then over values, scarce status, power, and resources. So when I look at this definition, I see that word social. So that really means that when we're talking about conflict, we're talking about that relationship element. And then the struggle. So that tug of war or that pull, that word struggle is even in Hawker and Wilmot's definition. So we're going to see that keep getting used again and again. Between opponents, so we have this kind of opponent style of the struggle. And I think the tug of war analogy for Lewis Kosser's definition here. And then here we have that word scarcity. Scarcity is going to be a word we use often. And the scarcity, when we use the word status comes from Aristotle, and the injuries, status injuries, which when we get into the emotion week and we talk about anger, we'll look at status injuries. And then this idea of power. So is our relationships built on power dimensions of hierarchies, or do we have a relationship where we're supposed to be equals, peers, or have this solidarity? So sometimes our conflicts reside on these different perspectives of power and resources. So resources are the things that we are wanting or needing and we're drawing from. And we're going to look a lot at the word resource. So this definition, although it's outdated and we're going to use a different one, it has all the seeds, the planting of seeds of things that we need to start paying attention to. Martin Deutsch is considered basically the father of our modern sensibility of how we understand conflict. So by 1973, we're getting that word resolution to start coming into the vernacular of modern day conflict theory. And Martin Deutsch, well, let's look at his definition, and then I'll talk a bit more about Martin Deutsch. A conflict exists whenever incompatible activities occur. One party is interfering, disrupting, obstructing, or in some other way making another party's actions less effective. Sabotage, right? We have an element of sabotage in this definition here. So a conflict is incompatible. This is another important word when we have incompatibility. And that something about what the other person wants is interfering, disrupting, obstructing what the other party wants. So somehow the other party or parties' actions are now an obstacle. And that's part of the incompatibility. And this brings us to our more modern day, the Hawker and Wilmot definition, which is the definition we will be using in this class. It has a lot of these words in it that come from these two definitions that I'd like to start with. So let's put a pin in these words and make sure that we start thinking about how we can, from the way that we would describe a conflict from the last slide to this one, as we start, the first tools we're going to be using come from the definition and start changing our vocabulary as we describe a conflict. All right, now we're at the benefits of conflict. What? Conflict is beneficial, right? It's that idea of an opportunity. We have an opportunity here, and this is a picture of John Lewis, who is during the civil rights movement. And here is where we are turning to society and the conflicts that exist within a society that allow us to put a light and reconstruct our perspectives so that we can have the opportunity to do better, to be better. So in this slide, we will actually listen to an interview with John, the former and late great John Lewis. We'll listen to an interview with him later on in the term so we can kind of shift our perspectives of what it means for us to approach conflict in a way that can seize on the benefits of it, even when it's extremely painful and sometimes very destructive or violent. So conflict increases awareness of what problems exist, right? That's when we talk about the benefits of conflict, we want, if we never have a conflict, then we don't know what problems exist. And then we often can never have the opportunity to move into problem solving and be functional in working towards repair. So following our arrows on this slide, conflict motivates members of a group or an organization or relationship to consider a problem. What are the problems or problems that we need to address? Conflict promotes change, right? When we are active and care about others, we can be listeners and move and consider other perspectives. Conflict stimulates interest and creativity, right? So when we use this word creativity in light of benefits of conflict, what I'm trying to grasp here for you is this idea that creativity is a type of problem solving. And we want to think about creativity is most engaged and effective when we consider other perspectives other than our own. We're open to feedback, and we are leaning into the influence of others so that we can take on or see or be open to other worldviews other than our own. And when I say worldviews, this is the way that we perceive and organize our realities or belief structures, and what we decide to select to construct our worldview. As soon as we dialogue and consider others, we can expand that worldview. It's not supposed to shrink it. So sometimes when we have to sit in places where we are listening, we often feel like our worldview is shrinking, but we don't want to think about that. We want to think about it like an accordion, that it's starting to expand. Conflict can legitimize people's interests. So we want how we legitimize and consider others and create credibility. Conflict strengthens relationships. I talked about that. This is coming again from another perspective on conflict resolution and conflict management traditions. All right, our next one, conflict involves. So what does all of these things involve? Meaning, what do they include? We have incompatibility. And again, these are vocabulary words that we want to start incorporating as the first beginning tools to our toolbox. Incompatibility is this idea that what you want doesn't match what I want, or my goal is different than your goal. And not just that they're different, but they're incompatible, meaning that if you get what you want, I can't have what I want. In the most simplest kind of terms, that if you want tacos for dinner and someone else wants Chinese food for dinner, we have incompatible things, meaning that if we're going to go to dinner together to one location, are we going to get Chinese food, or are we going to go get our Mexican food, tacos? So that's the incompatibility. I'll bring this up again and again. If I want to go to the coast and my friend wants to go to the mountains, those are incompatible goals. They can't exist in the same space and time. So that's what incompatibility means. Interdependent parties, meaning that there is some way that our actions are interdependent with others, meaning that your actions will affect me and my actions will affect you. Now, sometimes we see actions happen by people that we are not in relationship with, that we do feel affects our daily life. But unless our actions are affecting someone else, we don't consider that an interdependent relationship. So when we are looking at interpersonal relationships, we are talking specifically about interdependent relationships where each other's actions. So if I have a roommate who doesn't pay their rent, that will directly affect me and my stability for my having a home. That would be because our relationship is interdependent. Even if we are not friends, we don't hang out together, I am still reliant on their participation in maintaining our shared space. Perceptions. So perception is our worldview. It's what we decide to select and what we don't select to make up our reality or how our belief structures, our values. And when we think about perceptions and the way that we're viewing interactions or the world or whatever it is that we are paying attention to, you want to think about it like one of those sound studios with those really big, giant sound levers, and there's all these different levers on it. And when you're with perceptions, which ones do you turn up the volume on and which ones do you only put on a low volume, or do you turn off other things altogether? It's actually probably would be too overwhelming if we tried to look at every single thing at the same time. So that's why we do this kind of mixing. And that's your perceptions. That's the perception process in a very quick little analogy. Incentives to cooperate and compete is the idea of what are the rewards, benefits, what are the cost risks, analysis that we're doing to decide to cooperate with others, to be more functional in how we're going to think about those resources, and the scarcity of things, or is it more competitive? Competition isn't necessarily inherently dysfunctional, but unfortunately, competition usually is our first signal that we might be leaning into a more dysfunctional way of dealing with a conflict situation when we are competing for those scarce resources. Interaction and communication. This is a communication class. We are going to be interacting and communicating. Even though we're online, we are going to create a shared communication space so that we can develop our communication skills and work on how we are incorporating our vocabulary. Bargaining and negotiating is what we do to find common ground and how we are actively pursuing moving through to that resolution place. So bargaining and negotiating have an element of resolution built into them. Strategy is also what we're doing all term, is we are finding those tools, the tools that best represent us and who we are, our backgrounds, our culture, our co-culture groups. It's also how we consider others and their cultural backgrounds, right? The strategy would be, how do we adapt? How are we considering bringing in empathy and other tools so that we can maintain a functional interaction? All right. So conflict management involves. So these are some of the skills that we're going to be working on. How we observe. So observing means that perception piece. How are we observing the world, the interaction, and considering other perspectives other than our own? So that will be a big component of this class, of how you are considering others' perspectives. Listening. We're also going to work on our listening skills. and the way that we approach a conflict, the startup into a conflict, as the Gottmans talk about the masters and the disasters. We are going to be thinking about our startup into things. How do we engage in a dialogue, which means how are we listening to others? Are we just listening for what we want to hear? That confirms our point of view, or are we listening to expand? Assessing the situation. These are another way of saying, how are we observing? Choosing from alternative strategies. That's what we're doing, getting your toolbox filled with different strategies and implementing a strategy. How do we not just study it in this class as theory and vocabulary, but how are we going to apply it? So the Gottmans and who from the Gottman Institute are psychologists who have dedicated, John Gottman and his wife have dedicated their lives to understanding what is happening in marriages and romantic relationships. But their work has become so universal. We can use their research and incredible depth of work to understand conflict in a lot of different relationships. So one of the things the Gottmans did, they started in the 1970s, and that's when we started using technology to observe people in conflict, meaning we'd set people up to heart rate monitors. We're going to film them. We're going to look at their facial expressions and nonverbals, the whole body, not just the face, and look at all the different nonverbals that are happening. We're going to line up that information with all the heart rate and blood and heart rate information. And then they took couples, they had them talk about something they disagreed with, and then they have them talk about other things in their relationship, and they kind of accumulated just vast information. And then they would return to couples through time, 10 years later, 15 years, 20 years later, who's still together, who's not. And then they would go back to those the 15 minutes of talking about a conflict, and they started to be able to pull similarities and patterns from relationship to relationship. And they came up with the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, which I also have a video for from this week from the Gottman Institute: criticism, defensiveness, contempt, and stonewalling. And this is a list of behaviors, communication behaviors that signal that a relationship is in its disaster or dysfunctional state. So when we talk about criticism, we're really talking about criticism of the other person and their things about their identity or their personality, where it's a direct attack against a person. That's different than a type of feedback, which we can get into later in the term, but this is specifically attacks against a personality. And then defensiveness is like actually the natural thing we would do if we were attacked. We'd want to repair, do the face work to repair our identity. However, defensiveness is, even though it has this kind of natural thing that we want to move into, it can escalate a conflict. And usually defensiveness also turns into an attack on the others. Well, you think I do this. Well, how many times have you done A, B, and C, right? I actually just did that for the first time, but you do this, this, and this every single day, right? So we repair identity, move into attack. This is another 4 horsemen of the apocalypse communication behavior. Contempt is when we have a constant barrage of corrections and pointing out flaws, whether it's from an action we're doing to the way that we talk. And if someone is in an environment where they're constantly experiencing contempt, communication, it really diminishes the ability to self-esteem and worth, and it can have really devastating attacks on that person's ability to have trust and feelings of wanting to be in an action place, of being invested in that relationship. When we think about stonewalling is when communication shuts down, where we either, if we don't physically leave, we move into this kind of implosion of ourself, and we kind of check out. That's what stonewalling is, or it can be that physically needing to leave, or not answering backs with affirmative communication behaviors to show that we're listening, we're just absent. When we talk about stonewalling, we're really talking about someone who is going through a physiological experience of flooding, and flooding is an amygdala hijack, and we're going to talk a lot about this term, where our amygdala is in a fight, flight, or fight situation, and the person who is stonewalling has moved into that kind of freezing and shut downing a flight mode to deal with the very painful experience of being flooded. Okay. The next slide here is about the progress triangle, and the progress triangle is a framework. So when we talk about strategy, we're talking about the way that we're going to create a frame for understanding the conflict. And I'd like to start with this framework right away. And the substantive part of the conflict, the procedural dimension, and the relationship dimension are all elements of a triangle. And I have this picture of an iceberg here so that you can see that even if we're at the top triangle of the iceberg, the conflict usually has a lot more depth to it, history to it, that there's all our experiences and our backgrounds and our culture, the languages that we are speaking, the words that we choose, and it gets, some of that feels kind of hidden. So the progress triangle is trying to bring it to the surface so we can address it. The substantive part of the conflict is the concrete part of the conflict, the tangible, concrete, meaning this is the issue, the specific matter we're dealing with. And the substantive dimension also kind of includes our goals, our wishes. What does resolution look like for us? The procedural dimension is the rules or the process, the norms. Some people feel a lot better with dealing with a conflict when they actually have those rules that they can lean into. Rules and process are great. They're good places to start, but conflict is context. There's so much context, and each individual is unique. And so rules and procedure can only take us so far if we don't address that relationship dimension of the conflict. And the relationship dimension is the dimension of the conflict that I talked about before, that has to do with hierarchies and power or solidarity. And these things help us kind of understand how to interpret situations. So if I think that I have solidarity with you, that we're peers and equals, and we run into a conflict where you are giving me orders or telling me what to do, where I'm like, why are you in charge of this? I thought we were equal. You can start to see that there'll be a conflict in just trying to deal with the relationship dimension. Let's establish what is the relationship and what is our credibility? What's my identity here? These are very important pieces to understanding a conflict. So you can't just lean into one. This is a framework or like a template where you're going to, when you're thinking about a conflict, you would use this different dimensions to start sorting out what's really going on in the conflict. And that's a strategy. That is a type of strategy as you progress into the negotiations or the dialogue into dealing with a conflict. So now we're getting to the definition from Hawker and Wilmot. The definition from Hawker and Wilmot is that conflict is an expressed struggle between at least two parties who perceive incompatible goals, scarce resources, and interference from others in achieving their goal, right? So these are things we've already been building through the lecture. And when we look at perceived interference, perceived incompatible goals, perceived scarce resource, we keep coming back to the word perceived, perceived, perceived. And if I could rename this class perceptions, I would. When we talk about what's happening in a conflict, we have our emotional life and we have our values and our belief structures and our culture and history. All of these things become part of the blocks of how we're going to deal with and manage a conflict. So conflict is inevitable. It's unavoidable. We are social creatures and we are negotiating space. We are trying to become better as a society, to be more inclusive and allow people to have economic mobility. We want in our relationships, the person who has decided to be in a relationship with us or someone who's decided to hire us to be on a job, what we want is to be able to be included, and we want that other person to be invested in including us. So well-managed conflicts can lead to better decisions, improved social cohesion, stimulate innovation, and increase morale. And this is what we are talking about when we are talking about the benefits of conflict. We're talking about how can we use conflict as an opportunity. And that means that in this class, we're going to talk about difficult conversations. We're going to talk about how we are different and how to be in the presence of difference. That means that we're talking about a type of openness and the skills that we're going to need to be in dialogue or conversations with people with different ways different ways they communicate because of their communication cultures, which is going to be next week. We got to know those communication cultures. One of the things I hear reported from students in this class, and I talked about this in my syllabus video as well, but I want to remind everyone as we come to the end of this video that this class is difficult. It will, whether you decide to focus on a conflict in your life or not, as we go through things and we start describing things, things will start bubbling up. Things that you thought you had wrapped up into a nice little neat package, you may have tied it up with a bow and put it away. All right, that happened to me and I don't want to think about it. But unfortunately, when you take a conflict management class, things sometimes start bubbling up to the surface. And just like a little oxygen bubble underwater, you know how it gets bigger and bigger and it gets to the surface and pop, oxygen bubble pops. That's kind of what might be starting to happen to you. Everyone's very different in the class and how they're processing the information. So consider me a resource. Find ways to think about how to process this in your weekly reports. You have to do journal entries. That's another way that you can include and process the information. So you can wrap it back up and put it away again if you'd like to, or find ways to take it out, play with it, and think about ways to grow. This class isn't about feeling shameful or guilty. It's a class about growing and understanding you in different contexts and different relationships, and how to be better in the face of difficult conversations. So with that note, this is the video for week 1, and I hope you have a good week 1, and I'm looking forward to learning more and conversing with all of you. Have a good week. Bye-bye.